All right, so this is the upside of downtime. Before we get into the talk, I don't know if you guys have seen this. I thought this was pretty funny. Someone put together a little bingo for velocity. Hopefully there's no bingos in this talk, but enjoy it if you're interested. So let me start off asking a question. Raise your hand if your site has gone down unexpectedly or work for a company that site has gone down. All right, I think that's pretty much everyone. But let me ask the reverse. Who hasn't had a site go down on them? All right, well, I thought there would be one guy. There's not. All right, well, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Lenny Rachitsky. I work for the Web Metrics division of Neustar, where we monitor our customers' websites for performance and availability. And that means that I've seen a lot of sites go down. I also blog at transparentuptime.com about downtime and transparency. I've also built a bunch of stuff, both on my own and inside the company, so I've felt the pain of downtime personally. So clearly sites go down a lot. Pretty much every site experiences downtime at some point, including the biggest sites in the world, the ones that should be able to avoid it if they could. Sites like Amazon and Facebook and Wikipedia and Microsoft and CNN. And downtime really sucks for a lot of different reasons. It sucks for your business. You can't sell anything, obviously, if your site's down. It sucks for your brand. You have to work extra hard to make up for the hit that downtime brings. It sucks for people like us that have to deal with downtime and bring servers back online. It sucks for your users. The more they like your service, the more downtime is going to hurt them, right? So obviously downtime is bad. What can we do about it? Well, the first approach is to build your system so that it never fails. You could build your system with the best people, the most expensive hardware, no single points of failure. You could have backup systems for your backup systems. You can build it in the cloud. You could scale across clouds. You could have complexity budgets. You can have automation. But in the end, it's going to fail. Werner Vogels, CTO of Amazon, famously said, everything fails all the time. Not only does it fails all the time. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be arguing with this guy. He's only built the most advanced and powerful computing platform the world has ever known. So why does everything fail? Why is it so hard to keep things from failing when there's millions of dollars riding on it to not fail? Well, there's a lot of reasons. The first is something called risk homeostasis, which basically says that the safer we make a system, the more risks we end up taking to compensate. Things like anti-lock brakes, studies have shown, make people drive more recklessly. Same thing with bicycle helmets and airbags. There's also black swan events, the kinds of events that are high impact, hard to predict, that no one saw coming but end up mattering the most in the end. Things like the stock market drop a few weeks ago that no one saw coming, or the YouTube downtime a few years ago that was caused by some routing table changes in Pakistan. Then there's the unknown unknowns, the things that you don't even know that you don't know. How do you build a system to not fail when you don't even know what you should be knowing about? And then there's just change. As soon as you think you have everything figured out and everything's perfect and nothing's going to break, you have to change it. You have to evolve your business. And you don't want to be that guy that's trying to resist change. Another reason things fail is that most times they're caused by a bunch of really small things, a lot of trivial things that fail in combination and lead to a domino effect. In the end, a lot of this just happens because we're human. We don't anticipate everything. We're not good at understanding highly complex systems. We don't interpret things correctly a lot of times. We make mistakes. So let me give a couple examples of failure in action. The first example is of the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979, which, if you were to look at it, is basically a bunch of pretty minor things that added up. It started off with a blockage in the plant's polisher system, which is basically a giant water filter. And these kinds of problems are not that unusual or serious, but in this case, the blockage caused moisture to leak into the plant's air system, which inadvertently tripped a couple valves, and that shut down the flow of cold water into the plant's steam generator. Luckily, they had a backup cooling system just for this situation, but on this particular day, for reasons no one really knows, it was disabled. Plus, the indicator in the control room that was supposed to tell the operators that it was disabled was blocked by a repair tag that was hanging above it. That left the reactor dependent on another backup system, but as luck would have it, the relief valve wasn't working properly that day either. And to make matters worse, a gauge in the control room, which should have told the operators that the relief valve wasn't working, was itself not working. So by the time the 3 Mile Island engineers realized what was happening, it was too late. In other words, a major accident caused by a number of discrete events, none of which were glaring errors or spectacularly bad decisions, all led to a major problem. This kind of disaster is what Yale's sociologist Charles Perrow famously called normal accidents, where normal does not mean that it happens often, but instead means that it's the type of accident you would expect in the normal functioning of a technologically complex system made up of thousands of individual parts. And I bet if I were to look at each of your architectures, it'd be a technologically complex system made up of thousands of individual parts. Just last week, Intuit went down for over 24 hours thanks to an accidental power failure. A few years ago, Rackspace went down when a truck crashed into their transformer. A couple weeks ago, WordPress went down along with 10 million blogs that it hosts thanks to an errant code change that overrode a bunch of stuff in their database. And that brings us to the next big problem. Not only is failure inevitable, but the bigger and more successful you are, the quicker everyone is going to find out about your failure, and the faster that news is going to spread. Clay Shirky, author of Here Comes Everybody and all-around smart guy, summarized it really well, that unhappy customers may get some attention, but unhappy networked customers can quickly impact your business. Here's a quick example of what happened last time Google App Engine went down. Within a few minutes, Twitter was going nuts. People were wondering what was happening. They were surprised that the mighty Google would fail. They were concerned about the ramifications of Google App Engine being down. They even started talking like cats. And so this is what happens on Twitter when sites go down. There's a huge spike in mentions of that brand. And so that behavior is so common, I wrote a tool that crowdsources this, that watches Twitter for certain brands and notifies me at this point when that site is down simply based on people talking about it on Twitter. So in this case, I noticed that S3 was down a few weeks ago. So you can check that out at labs.webmetrics.com. And it's not just Twitter. It's things like blogs and Google Alerts, social media monitoring tools, and traditional media monitoring services that go straight to our phones. So let's do a quick recap. Your site's going to fail. Failure is bad. And everybody's going to find out about it. So it sounds pretty hopeless, but what if we don't want to become lumberjacks? Well, operations guru John Alspa, who's at this conference, put it really well. That instead of trying to avoid failure, instead we should embrace it, that we should lean into it. We should let it guide our architecture and our code and our infrastructure. And that brings us to the second approach to failure, preparing for it. Now, let me quickly clarify that I'm not saying you shouldn't work as hard as you can to keep your systems from failing. I think your number one goal should be to have zero downtime. But as we saw, that's futile in the end. So how do you deal with it? How do you prepare for it? And how do you make the most of it? So let's see if we can learn from a few quick examples of how other companies have dealt with this type of situation. The first example is of how not to handle it is Facebook. No offense. So May 7th, their Graph API went down. Pretty quickly, some people started wondering what was going on. There were tweets like this, complaining about the downtime, complaining there was no word from Facebook. It ended up being down for over 13 hours. We started seeing negative stories like this on blogs, wondering what was going on. There was a lot of speculation about the severity and whether Facebook could be trusted, being such an integral part of the web. The New York Times started questioning Facebook's integration with everything around the internet, and they included a pretty searing quote at the end, that an outage of this length with no official communication from a company is disturbing. So in the case of Facebook, we end up with this feeling of disturbing. And for a company that's trying to become the center of our lives online, that's not the kind of reaction you want to get. The second example is Google App Engine. in February 24th, they went down. They went down pretty hard. Pretty quickly, people started noticing the problem. But notice that these tweets include a link to their public health dashboard. If you were to go to the public health dashboard, you'd see that they were well aware of the problem, and they were posting updates as to what they think is wrong, how soon they think it'll be resolved, and what they're doing about it. They also posted some updates to their dedicated Google group and mailing list, letting people know that they're working on it. And again, blogs picked up the story, started talking about what's going on, but instead of speculating, they included actual quotes from the public health dashboard and the official communications. The blogs continued to update the story as it progressed throughout the day. And again, one thing you notice reading these blogs is there's very little speculation because they don't have to speculate. Google's telling them exactly what's happening. And if you were to go to the Google group forum, you'd notice every hour they updated their users as to where things are, what they're doing about it, and how soon they think things are going to be resolved. The downtime lasted about 3 hours, and then about a week later, they put out a pretty awesome postmortem that went through what happened, included a minute-by-minute timeline. They talked about what they're doing about it, and things like that. Now, contrast this to the reaction that Facebook got. You see words like awesome, and kudos, and more kudos. Even Jesse Robbins applauded the way that they handled this downtime. Even the media didn't treat them so badly. They even compared them to a small-time data center in Australia that completely denied the downtime. So in the case of Google App Engine, we end up with this feeling of kudos. And let's not forget that this was after a major downtime event, not something that generally leads to any sort of praise. Third example is Atlassian. In April, on April 11th, they had a pretty serious security breach, which is not quite the same thing as downtime, but it's pretty close. It's good enough for the case I'm trying to make. So the next morning after their breach, I got this email from them telling me exactly what happened. If not for this email, I never would have known that anything was wrong. A couple hours later, they sent another email explaining, filling in some holes that the original email left open and addressing some concerns that their customers had. The next day, their CEO posted a really detailed blog post explaining what they're doing about it, what happened, how it could have happened, and how they're improving. As I was writing this talk, I noticed that they've been updating this blog post with more news of where they're at and how they're improving the situation. Rightfully so, there were a bunch of angry customers. There's no way to avoid getting mad at a company that exposes your private passwords. But thanks to their upfront transparency, they actually came out rather well. You see words like a stand-up company. People called them outstanding. People said that this is how every company should handle this kind of thing. We see words like bravo. And so in the case of Atlassian, we ended up with this feeling of bravo. They got applauded for their proactiveness. And I think that builds stronger customer relationships. These customers aren't going to be leaving Atlassian or Google for that matter. I think they're even more committed now. How many happy customers do you get after a major downtime event? It's hard enough to get this kind of reaction when you actually try to do something good. And so part of the reason for this kind of reaction is the culture and the brand that Atlassian has built, which includes values like open company, no BS. And there's a reason companies like Atlassian and Google come out on top, while companies like Facebook don't. It's not a one-time event. It comes from a commitment to certain values and following through on your values and doing it over and over and over, and doing right by your customer when the opportunity arises, not just when it's convenient. And that's what downtime is. It's a huge opportunity to build trust and to treat your customers with respect. It's also a huge opportunity to destroy trust. It's a lot easier to destroy trust. It basically happens by default. Your customers have a really low bar for what they expect from you. They basically expect that you're going to screw them every chance you get. So if you act human and do something good for them, they're going to love you for it, and they're going to trust you. And in today's world, especially for web companies like ours, I would say that trust is maybe the most important asset that you can earn. So let's talk about how you can use this opportunity to build trust and how you can prepare for downtime. So before I get into the framework, let me say that doing any of this is better than doing nothing. You can start small. You can see how it goes. It's more of a mind shift than anything else. I'm also hoping that most of the stuff is obvious once you see it, which would mean that it's easy to convince other people to do it. So that would be a good thing. So here is the basic sequence of events during a downtime event. Life is good. Some have breaks, you fix it, and then you figure out where to go from there. The preparation framework I'm going to talk about includes preparing prior to the downtime, communicating during the downtime, and then explaining after the downtime. So again, the 3 parts: prepare, communicate, explain. Let's start with prepare. Step 1 is to create a communication channel that lets you get news out to your users quickly and efficiently. The overall goal of this channel should basically be to tell your users what's going on. Without anything in place, which is how most companies are today, whenever your users are trying to use your service and they see something wrong, something is wrong, they have to decide, are they doing something wrong or is it your fault? And I would venture to say that they're going to assume that something is wrong with you. And so they're going to create the psychological impression that you're down all the time. Instead, if you were to actually tell them when something is wrong, they're going to know when things are wrong, and they're going to stop assuming that things are broken, and they're going to realize that you're not broken as often as you think. And so it's a little ironic that the more open you are and the more you tell them how often you're down, the less down they're going to think you are. So here's some examples of communication channels. Here's Amazon's health dashboard that shows you the status of every one of their individual services from each of their regions. Notice along the bottom, they're pre-announcing some downtime, a maintenance window that's coming up. Here's Salesforce's public health dashboard. Here's Google's. Notice that they're not shy about showing you when things are actually broken. Google also has a dedicated Google group where they post details about what's going on. Zendesk has a dedicated Twitter account, very simple, where they post updates about what's going on. Foursquare has a Twitter account for their API. 37 Signals has a pretty simple blog where they simply post updates of what's going on and where things are at. You can get pretty creative with this stuff and have fun with it. This is GitHub's public health dashboard. So the communication channel needs to be easy to find. Users need to know where to find it when they think something's broken. If they can't find it when they think something's wrong, that defeats the purpose. So I would say create a link to it from your support page. Make sure that you get to the top of Google search rankings when people search for your brand and status or your brand and down. You also want to try to host this off-site. If you're down, the last thing you want is for this to be down. Again, that defeats the purpose. Google and Salesforce had this problem not long ago, so it's not an obvious problem. You also want to make this as real-time and automated as possible. Because when people notice a problem, they're going to want to visit this right away. And if they don't see that anything's wrong, they're going to assume either they can't trust you, or they're just going to assume that, that it's their fault or something like that. So I put out a blog post not long ago, which includes 7 keys to a successful public health dashboard. If you're interested in building one, you can find it on transparentuptime.com, or you just Google for these words. So the first step is the channel. The second step is a process around that channel. Basically, the goal should be for the downtime event to be as procedural and simple and brain dead as possible. The first step is to figure out who has the authority to communicate externally during a downtime event. Who makes the call? Who needs to be involved? Who do you escalate to? Who can take customer-facing actions? This is also where you figure out what the legal issues are around communicating externally and who has the rights to decide what's allowed. The last thing you want is to go through a long process when you're down and have legal have to approve some communication. There's also something I like to call the mean time to communicate, which is basically an SLA that ideally you have internally that is something you commit to communicate externally as soon as something goes wrong. This is in addition to the ideal real-time status that goes out there that notifies your customers as soon as anything's wrong. This is where a human actually acknowledges the problem and adds more details about what is going on and how soon you think it'll be resolved. So the idea here is it's kind of like an SLA that you have internally. You know, there's no rule of thumb here. Just do whatever you can. Keep it as tight as possible. See how your users respond. And so the last step, obviously, is to have the stuff you guys already have, on-call procedures, drills, escalations, actually be ready to fix the problem. That's a whole other talk. So I'm not going to get into that. So your servers break. The incident happens. You go down. That brings us to the second phase, the communicate phase. The basic goal is to just communicate what's going on to your users. Ideally, use the communication channel that we talked about in the previous step. Your goal should be to get an update out within the meantime to communicate. You want to talk about who's affected and what parts of your systems are affected. You'll want to talk about when the incident started so that your users can tie that to the things that they're seeing on their end. Maybe the most important thing, which unfortunately is the hardest thing to get, is an ETA, to tell your users when you think you'll be back. So do that if you can. I know that's a hard thing to get. And the reason this is important is your users have to figure out, should I fail over to a backup system? Should I just go get some coffee? Should I wait it out? So that's important. And just as important is, do you want to update this regularly? You can't just put out an update. We're working on the problem. We'll be back sometime and then go away for 10 hours, right? People are going to stop trusting you after that. So you want to make sure to keep updating it. And then the final step is actually fix the problem. Again, that's a separate talk, but very important. All right, so everything's back to normal. Your servers are online. And that brings us to the final phase, the explain phase, which is basically made up of a postmortem that you post, ideally within a week of the incident, where you explain what happened, who was affected, what was affected, things like that. And the idea of the postmortem is you want to make sure that your customers feel like you're taking this seriously, that you know what you're doing, that you're going to improve for the future, that things aren't going to keep breaking every day. So the first step, you want to admit failure. This is something that actually is harder than you think. Even if it's not your fault directly, even if it's your cloud provider that went down, or some routing issue along somewhere on the internet, to your customers, you're down. And so you need to admit that you're down. Just be simple about it. This is an example of WordPress when they were down a few years ago. Right up front, the CEO admits, we were down for 2 hours. It was the worst downtime of 4 years. You don't have to be clever about it, just admit it. The second step, maybe the most important, is you want to sound like you're human. This is really, really important and something that big companies are really, really good at avoiding. This is not what you want to say because it basically means nothing. And it shows no humanity. The 37 Signals guys put it really well that say you bump into someone on the street or spill coffee on them, are you going to say, I apologize for any inconvenience I may have caused you? No. You instead, say something like, we screwed up and we're sorry and here's what we're doing to fix it so that it doesn't happen in the future. There's no template for this because that would defeat the purpose, but do what you can. The third point is you want to talk about the start and end time of the incident so that your users can figure out how that correlates to the things they're seeing. This is the little screenshot of Google App Engine's minute-by-minute timeline of their downtime event. So that's going the extra mile. You want to talk about who was impacted and what parts of your system are impacted so your users know, should I care about this? Does this affect me in any way? Then the meat of the whole postmortem is what went wrong, what happened. The example here from Zendesk being down, they talk about how their DNS settings got screwed up, and then their upstream ISP went down at the same time. They had to spend all this time figuring out they're totally unrelated and having to fix those problems individually. And then last but not least is a section on lessons learned. What did you take away from this? What are you doing to improve for the future? This is what your user is going to look for to figure out. Do you actually know what you're doing? Are you trying to fix things? In this example from 140.com, they had a really simple postmortem, but they had 3 really solid takeaways. Get some external performance monitoring, fix the root cause of the problem, and make sure that we understand the alerts that we're getting. Make sure that they're not overwhelming. So that's pretty much all you need in a postmortem. Pretty straightforward. I posted this on my blog a few months ago, and just a couple weeks ago, I got this post from someone that actually implemented just the postmortem step at his company. And I was pretty excited to see that it worked out really well. So, is that you? Nice. All right, go talk to that guy. All right. And so, not only do you want to talk about the lessons you've learned, you also want to actually implement the stuff that you talk about. If you keep failing and not improving and pretending like you're fixing problems, people are going to lose all that trust. So you actually want to implement the stuff that you've implemented. Google App Engine, when they went down, they talked about how they're adding a new feature to their data store, allowing users to select, do you want a faster data store or do you want a reliable data store, instead of deciding one or the other for them. They also talked about how they're going to change their on-call procedures and their training. So And thanks to that, there's actually more positive feedback that Google got from Hacker News. This was the highest rated comment on Hacker News after the incident, that not only are they just saying sorry, they're actually implementing serious changes that's costing them millions of dollars. So users respond to that kind of thing. And so I mentioned the Google App Engine postmortem a bunch. It's the best postmortem I've ever seen. So if you're looking for a good model or some ideas, I would check it out. You could just Google for Google App Engine postmortem, little meta. Or you could just check it out on my blog. So the overriding goal of this phase is be human. Be authentic. Your users know that you make mistakes. And they're going to forgive you if they think that they can trust you. And that means being transparent, not trying to hide the problem, accepting responsibility, letting them know that the buck stops here, and giving a feeling that you're learning, that you're improving, that things are going to get better. And almost all of this ends up coming down to the simple idea of trust. Can your users trust you? That's really what all this is about, and everything I've talked about is to give you tools to help you build that trust. Here's a little cheat sheet that you can check out offline that has the entire framework. And I think the same framework can be used for any kind of big disaster, say a security breach, maybe a big bug that you've discovered that no one knows about yet. In the end, it comes down basically to being prepared, being transparent, and being human. And that leads to trust. So one more disclaimer. Don't expect to be able to go down all the time and go through this framework and build all kinds of trust. There's a limit to how often you can go down, and I put some thought into that, but in the end, it feels like it really depends on the severity of your downtime, how you handle that downtime, things like that. But the way I see it is, the better you handle your downtime, the less of an emotional impact it's going to leave on your users, and the less they're going to remember that downtime, which means you can go down more often. So that's good. So how do we get this adopted? How do we get this adopted at your company? Maybe the most important part. Here's a few tactics. First tactic, a little bit of game theory. Hopefully you guys can follow this. Along the top is your choices, whether you decide to be transparent about the downtime. Along the left are your realities, whether people find out about it. So say that you went down, you swept it under the rug, and nobody finds out about it. You didn't have to invest anything up front. Nobody was the wiser, so that's a win. A little bit of a dirty win, but it's a win. Now say that news of your downtime spreads. Say that Twitter starts buzzing about it and people start blogging about it, and then you have to apologize retroactively. And it kind of convince people that you know what's going on, that you know what you're doing, that you're taking this seriously. I'd say that's a big loss. This is what happened in the Facebook example. Now say you were transparent. Say you were upfront and notified your users before they found out about the downtime. This is what happened in the Google App Engine example, and I think that turned out rather well for them. Now say that you were not caught. Say you were transparent, notified your users, we went down, here's what went wrong, but they never would have found out about it otherwise if you hadn't communicated. This is what happened in the Atlassian case, and as we saw, that ended up being a pretty good win for them. So taking a step back, it looks pretty good for the transparency case, but the punchline is that pretty soon, everyone's going to be able to know everything that's going wrong with your site. The things that people are going to be setting up to monitor all of the services that they're using. The more real time that news gets, the bigger Twitter gets. So this might not happen today, might not happen next year, but I think there's going to be a tipping point maybe in 3 to 5 years where every problem that you have is going to be public. And so the key is to be watching for that tipping point and to be ready. If that's not enough for you, here's a little handy-dandy list of benefits. We already talked about the trust that you gain. We talked about how it reduces churn and increases loyalty. It also reduces your support cost, having a public dashboard that your users can go to service themselves versus calling you or emailing you when downtime happens. That saves you a lot of time and money. It also gives you an ability to control the message versus allowing people to speculate about what's going wrong. It gives you a competitive advantage if your competitors aren't already doing this. Gives you more time, especially for a small company, to focus on the actual problem versus fielding calls from customers and trying to spin the situation as it's happening. It also reduces stress for people like us, so that's important. Still, it's not going to be easy. Change is never easy, especially at a big company. It's painful and it's slow, but it's not impossible. Here's what I see as the keys to adoption. The biggest thing you have to get over is the default culture of hide the problem. When you're a kid and you break your mom's vase, you're not naturally inclined to tell her, I broke this. You want to hide it. You want to pretend someone else did it. But as you grow up, you realize you're better off just admitting to the problem. And so in a sense, this is what companies have to do. They have to basically grow up. Just as important is the motivation and the commitment to actually want to improve things. Otherwise, when things go down, you don't want to say anything, or you can't say anything, or you just give a bunch of happy talk, which is going to do more harm than good. One way to look at transparency is it actually forces you to be a better company because you have to live up to the promises you make and the things that you put out there, which I'd say is a good thing. Now, to do a lot of the stuff, you actually need resources, and hopefully I've given you enough ammo to get those resources. A lot of this gets easier if you're experiencing a lot of pain today from downtime, especially if that pain is from just a simple perception of the downtime that you're having. So if you're going through pain, you have very little to lose. There's no reason not to try something like this. In the end, it comes down to buy-in from a lot of different people in a lot of different departments. So let me see if I can help you with that. There's basically 4 department groups you got to worry about: product management, support, the technical engineering operations, and then sales and marketing. Say you were to go to product management, they might say, let's wait for people to complain. We don't want to blast our entire customer base with a problem they might not know about. The reality is that over-communicating is 100 times more effective than under-communicating. It's a lot harder to convince your customers that you know what you're doing if you're trying to apologize retroactively. If you go to your support department, they might say, this is too much work. We have enough stuff to deal with. We don't want to worry about a new tool, a new process. The reality is that it's a little bit more work up front, but during the actual incident, when they're most stressed out and having the most work, this saves them, especially because customers can service themselves. They don't have to get calls and emails. The other bonus to support is a lot of times when you go down, support has no idea what's going on. And so they can themselves visit these dashboards and these status updates and be involved in the process, which improves a lot of things. Engineering, probably the easiest department to convince, but they might say, we don't want to tell anyone we did something wrong. The reality is that this is a huge opportunity for them to improve and to learn from other people, especially if you put it out there, if you put your technical details out to the public. They might learn from other people about what they're doing wrong, what they can use. Sales and marketing may be the hardest department to convince. They don't want anything to ever go wrong. And more importantly, they don't want anyone to find out about anything going wrong. The reality is people are going to find out that things are wrong, and things are going to go wrong, and you're better off controlling the message and being out ahead of the speculation. Another tactic you could use with this department is threaten them. Say that your competition might release this pretty soon, so we should get ahead of them. Here's the entire thing, so you can check that off online. So a little bit more ammo. Here's all the companies that I found that are using some of these tactics. So you can get some social proof. On my blog, there's a link to a Delicious tag that has links to all of the public health dashboards and status blogs that I found over the years, so you can check that out, transparentuptime.com. And it's simple as that. Basically, your site is still going to fail. It's not going to be fun. It's going to hurt. But it all comes down to how prepared are you for these kinds of failures. I've always wanted to use a Nietzsche quote in a talk, so I found an extremely appropriate one, that the measure of society is how well it transforms pain and suffering into something worthwhile, or better said, the measure of a company is how well it transforms the pain of downtime into something worthwhile. If you take nothing else away from this talk, please register a special Twitter account. Post updates to it, let your customers know about it, and just keep at it. Keep it up. That's it. Thank you very much. You can find the slides at this URL up there. You can find the exact framework at that URL below there. Thank you very much.